Well, welcome everybody. I appreciate you sharing your Tuesday evening with me. My name is Josh Walker. I'm at a firm called TxA Architects. We do schools all across the state of Texas. And I got my license back in 2019 when, pre-pandemic, when you could only test in person. And a lot of the resources that we're going to go over today didn't exist. Just that we've seen a bit of a crazy renaissance in materials for 5.0 because back then 5.0 was a lot newer than it is now. And now the testing companies and organizations have started cultivating their resources a little better. So we're going to go over a lot of that today. We're going to go over some basic information that is useful to know about new testing standards and procedures and how to take best advantage of that. So this slide exists as a disclaimer. I'm going to talk a lot about facts, which is stuff that NCARB puts out and what we know. And I'm going to talk a lot about opinions, stuff that I think from my testing experience and my experience advising others as sort of a mentor at two different firms now. And then so I'm going to try and draw the line between what's fact and what's opinion and make it very clear as we go. But if at any point it's unclear, I got my eye on the chat, drop a question. By all means, let's make sure that it's clear as we go. And to the question about online exams, yeah, we'll talk about that because that's a big one. So let's dive straight into this. First place I'd start if I'm going to test, payattencarb.org. They are of course, the test makers. They know what's on there. They know what you need to know, and they set the procedures for preparing for the exam and what your testing experience is going to look like. And honestly, their website's gotten a lot better these past couple of years. Their resources are fuller. They're being very intentional about partnering with organizations. Take advantage of the ncarb.org past the ARE tab up at the top, because they've got a lot of resources there that are very useful to start. Sharna, can we kick out that survey real quick?
Yep, we'll do.
We have one quick survey question. I hope everybody can jump on and take care of. This is very informative for me so that I can focus where I spend my time talking. I have to touch on everything because this is going to be recorded, and people who will be taking this or watching this having not taken any exams. But my guess is, if this is anything like the last session, most of you have taken an exam or two. So if you wouldn't mind, answer that question for me now as I cover the divisions. So, of course, if you've taken any of the exams, you know they have 6 exams over the course of getting licensed. You have to pass them all before you can get a license in any given jurisdiction. They list them in this order. This is not a required testing order. You can take them in any order that you want. I have a recommendation, and we'll go over that in the future, later half of these slides. The exams actually used to be longer, if you believe it or not. They used to be, I want to say the shortest one was 4 hours. And they've actually taken some questions out of what used to be required. And so these have actually gotten a little bit more approachable than they used to be, though of course they are still very intensive. Interesting results on this survey. A lot of people saying they haven't taken an exam yet. That's awesome. I'm very excited that you are here, and we can talk about resources from scratch to help you before you get too far down the road. I think I might be the very bottom one of these participants down here, and then we've got a few people who are in the process of testing. So that's really good to know. Thanks for doing that. Of course, these exams don't come free because, NCARB has to pay their costs of developing the exams and managing it and proctoring it and supervising candidates and keeping records active. So they've got fees to take these and cover their costs, of course. I know it's expensive. It's not fun. Trust me, it was this price when I took them too. But you know, if you know that you need to reschedule it 30 days in advance, you can always reschedule for free. So my advice is schedule it early and then just hold yourself to that exam date. But if you have to reschedule it, do it 30 days out. There are resources out there to help you pay for exams. The state of Texas has a scholarship through the Texas Board of Architectural Examiners. If you go to their website, if you pass, thanks Sharna, she dropped it in the chat. If you pass a certain number of exams, you can get a reimbursement for, I think it's like $500, which is pretty helpful. And a lot of firms will reimburse you for the cost of 6 exams once you pass them all, once you get licensed. I personally think that should be an industry standard practice because this is just another form of professional development. So if your firm doesn't do that, advocate for it because that's a growing thing that I think should be the norm in our industry personally. When you take these exams, you've got 5 years to finish before your first exam expires. So if I took an exam, actually back when I was testing, my first one was in 2018, it could theoretically still be active, would be active, and I could still be testing. So I could have passed them all in 2018 and still, you know, or passed 5 of them and still, you know, get around to taking my 6th one next week. Or I could have taken 1 back then and take 4 this year. And then when that first one hits the 5-year mark, I'll have to go back and retake it because in all honesty, I don't remember what I did last week. I don't remember what I had for breakfast 3 weeks ago, and I eat the same thing for breakfast every day. So the idea that I'm retaining that information on an exam that I took 5 years ago is honestly a little generous. So you've got 5 years before you have to basically renew your passing status on any given exam. They do have restrictions on how often you can retake exams. You have to wait 60 days to retake it. You can only take it up to 3 times per running year. So that means starts on the first time you test, 3 times, and then you hold until one of the first one expires. And that's the same running clock system. My personal recommendation, again, opinion, is if you take the test twice and you don't pass it that second time, I don't think you ought to run off and try and take it a 3rd time. There's probably some block that's going on. Your study material isn't covering some content. You're mentally just burnt out on that material. There's something going on that you don't really want to gamble with that 3rd time if you don't have to. Take a break, study something else, take a different exam, and maybe you'll pick up information in that study material that's beneficial to this, or maybe you'll find a different material provider that's more helpful for you that you can then use to come back and take that original exam for the 3rd time and be more successful. You notice I'm not talking about failing exams. Honestly, taking exams is a success. It's a hard thing to put yourself through the work of studying and preparing and setting time aside and scheduling and actually taking an exam. That's success to me. I always tell people, no matter what, have basically a reward for every time you test, because whether you pass or not, treat yourself to a reward because what you did was good and deserves to be treated. You know, I took myself to a movie. Well, I know a lot of people take themselves out to dinner or go get a drink with friends afterwards. Whatever it is for you, find some way to reward yourself after taking an exam, because whether you pass or not is basically immaterial. You did the hard part just by taking it. And so I think It's very easy to feel judged by the idea of taking an exam and failing it, but statistically, that's the norm. These exams have like a 40 to 60% pass rate per exam, and that means you're gonna fail one at some point. There are people out there who hit them all on the first go, and there are people out there who it takes several tries at each time. It's just you and your testing experience. It's going to be unique to you, and that's, as long as you're putting in the work and doing your best, that's not something to feel ashamed about. I think it's actually something to be commended. So moving on, let's talk about the format of these exams. There's, of course, the introduction and the conclusion. They have these like questionnaires that they want you to answer before and after to kind of gauge your exam experience and how people are feeling going into and coming out of these. If you're testing in the center, there's a login and a screening process and that kind of thing. If you're testing at home, there's basically a software setup and a room review kind of process where they make sure that you're testing in an environment that's conducive to that and not conducive to unfair advantages. So whatever you do, there will be time that you need to set up and have set aside for kind of the ceremony around testing. The test itself is divided into two sections: the discrete items, which are basically all of the information is unique to that one question. People will colloquially refer to this as multiple choice section. It's not strictly, but that's helpful to think of it. And then there's the case studies. That's where they give you basically this big bank of information. And I do mean like they've got sections of the code book. They've got a spec maybe. They've got a prompt for the project. They've got a site plan, a floor plan, and they've got all these PDFs basically that you can access. And then they give you a series of something like 10 questions, and you basically have to go and find or make the answers out of all of this reference material that they give you. And so it's more of a process of how well can you quickly identify where to find key information, go retrieve it, and then apply it to this bank of questions to be most helpful. And they do have generally 2 of those per exam. So 2 banks, 2 case studies. If you want practice at this, which you should want practice at this, NCARB has put out a demonstration exam. It's a practice where you can experience the sort of process of sitting through the banks of questions, the format of the exam, the types of questions that they'll throw at you, the experience of the clock ticking down in the upper right hand corner. All of that. I don't think it's exam specific. It's kind of an amalgamation of all the exams thrown together. But yeah, take advantage of that. It's super helpful. And I don't know if it includes a case study sample, but I think it should. When you take your exam, there is a break. I had some colleagues who were testing and swore that there wasn't a break option during their exam. There is. It's just not intuitive to find sometimes. I think it's the top left corner somewhere. The practice will show you where that is. But definitely take advantage of this. Your brain is not meant to work in 3-hour chunks. I think, I don't remember the studies, but I think the studies showed something between like half an hour and 1 hour at best is how your brain is meant to cycle. So you can take your break whenever you want. The caveat is you can't go back and look at questions that you've already seen from before the break. So that break is basically you splitting the exam in half and leaving everything you've seen behind. And that changes the strategy for taking the exams, in my opinion. I used to tell people when the the break, so I guess I got to give some history to this. Used to be, you could take your break whenever you wanted, but it was a shorter break. And of course, you could only test in very proctored, prometric environments, which meant that they knew you weren't referencing study material during your break because you couldn't access any of it. Well, now the breaks are longer and you could be testing at home, which means you could be accessing study materials or Googling questions while you're on your break or calling a friend or whatever. They can't guarantee you don't do that. So they just don't let you go back and review questions from before. They just made that a hard line, but they extended the amount of break time you get so you can take an actual brain break. So pros and cons there. My personal opinion is when you're working through the discrete section, which is generally how I suggest you start the exam, I suggest you go through it very quickly. Any question that you think will take you longer than 2 minutes to answer, flag it, skip it. And then make your first pass, get all of the easy answers, because the questions have various difficulties. They're not all the same. There are some that are almost gimmies, and there are some that are just meant to like break you. They just throw curveballs in there on purpose, just to see how you can manage your time and whether you can actively manage your resources, including your mental resources. So I say go through all of the discrete questions as fast as you can, skip all the ones that look like they're going to be tricky, knock that out. But keep an eye on the clock. Don't let the clock dip under approximately an hour and a half. I think an hour and a half is what you need for your case studies. Your mileage may vary. That could be 2 hours for you, that could be an hour for you. I don't really know. But remember that every question is worth the same amount. The case studies aren't worth more, they're not worth less, but generally case study questions take longer to answer. And so if you're gonna get all the way through the discrete questions, you're gonna get more points because you're gonna see more questions in less time. So go through there, get all your easy questions, and then keep an eye on the clock. And then once you get through your first pass, now you can go back and review the ones that you skipped. And you have less pressure on your brain because you don't have this mass of questions waiting for you to get to them. And you have a much easier time management situation where you can just work on these questions and work like sequentially to harder and harder levels of questions until you get to that point where you're like, okay, it's time for me to move on to case studies. Then you take your break. You get a brain break, you reset, you come back, and you knock those case studies out, basically with the same method. That's my personal advice on test taking strategy. Just knowing the criteria and the restrictions that are placed on you with this sort of unique format. Any questions before we move on from here? All right, let's carry on. Which they're transitioning to a new test provider. So just double check when you schedule your appointment. It might not be Prometric, but it's basically the same. It's just a different company that does the same service. Or should you take your exam online? I personally work from home. I go into the office once every blue moon or to a client site even more often than that. So you would think I would say, yeah, working from home is great. And I'm an introvert. I don't want to go to a testing center. But I actually quite like the testing centers for this purpose. And the reason is I feel more comfortable with the idea that I need to budget some time to get there and make my appointed slot. And yeah, the chairs are a little uncomfortable. Like I'm willing to put up with all of that because if I take the test at home and my internet goes out, I'm done. Like, that's all you can do. Your technology situation needs to be darn perfect for taking this exam, because if you disconnect, there's no reconnect option. So keep that in mind. I don't really want that extra anxiety hanging over me while I'm taking a stressful test. They do have resources available to try and mitigate that. They have a service that's free where you can basically set up you can do all of the setup on your computer at home, and they'll log in and they'll say, okay, your computer is running this software, or your computer can't run this software because it has certain restrictions. And so you'll have to either make adjustments, or maybe it's not really an option for you. They'll figure that out. They'll also, basically, you'll fire up the software if your computer can run it, and they'll look through the camera and they'll help you set up, like, okay, your room needs to meet these requirements. You can't have open windows to the outside because somebody might be flashing you note cards. You can't have this, that, or the other. Televisions, I think, are a pretty big no-no. So my office would never pass. I have way too much around me to pass that kind of approval process for a testing environment. So I'd have to go maybe I'd go to the office that day and I'd use the company internet and a conference room or something like that. But just know that that service is available. They can and will help you set up your space and your technology to make at-home testing possible for you if you want that. It's just not something I'm personally very comfortable with, and so that would stress me out, and I don't need another stressor during the exam. On the plus side, you can get snacks on your break, but I never had any problem taking snacks to the testing center. So your mileage may vary. It is the exact same exam whether you take it at home or in the center, though. They're not going to change questions. There's nothing about the format that's different. It's exactly the same. The questions that you might get when you're taking this. There's your classic multiple choice. Everybody knows what that is. But they have a few other options as well. There's a check all that apply. These you want to read very carefully. Make sure you understand how many of these boxes you're supposed to check. Because if it says 3, but you check 4 because you're waffling between, your next best option, that's it. You missed that question because you checked one too many boxes on accident. So read that one carefully. Make sure you know exactly what the question is asking. Quantitative fill in the blank. Keyword here is quantitative. They're never going to ask you a vocabulary question and ask you to just type the word out. That's not how this works. It's not a word, it's a number. They're asking you to do the math and then just type in the solution. So that's, people worry about the fill in the blank questions. I'm just going to encourage you. It's math. You either got it right or wrong. You're not going to get docked for misspelling something. Hotspot. That's basically, they give you a drawing. It's often a detail or a site plan, something like that. And it's more or less a question of where's the best place for X, or where is something wrong in this picture? And you have to click the right spot. We don't know where the line is between what's close enough and what's not. There's supposedly some like acceptable area, and it's not a specific dot, but we don't know how big that area is. So my advice is get as dead set on the center. If you think it's right there, you pick right there. But if you think it's either right there or just a spot just a little north of it, maybe you can cheat that one and try and split the difference and you'll end up in the area. I don't know. They never give us an example of how generous that area is. So I put that to your discretion. Drag and place, basically the same thing, but you're just dragging elements from kind of a menu on the left. Pay attention to those. Sometimes there's a rotate button, and you'll need to rotate an element in order for it to fit. So sometimes the question will say, what's the best location and orientation for X? And so you'll just need to know that there's a rotate button in that drag and drop sometimes. These questions, I get a lot of questions about like, what do I need to know? Do I need to have everything memorized? The answer is kinda, but not really. These exams are not, as I mentioned, vocabulary questions. They're not gonna ask, you know, who was the architect who designed X? It's very different from your college exams. It's a lot more of, well, as they put it, understand/apply or analyze/evaluate. And probably the most straightforward way to discuss this is just to look at some practice questions. Though they do go into depth in it in the handbook that's linked down the bottom. Highly recommend you review the handbook before you take your exams. So an example, understand/apply question. Architect has received a construction estimate for 850,000 square foot elementary school, but we're over budget by $420,000. The owner requests that you change your exterior wall type from a brick veneer cavity system with a metal stud backup to something more cost effective. The contractor has given us a list of options and said, here are the prices per square foot, pick the one. So first in booking the aesthetic, notice that phrase right here. So if we have to maintain a similar aesthetic, that means we need brick or something that looks like brick. So right away, we can cross out something that says form liner exterior finish, which looks nothing like brick. And we can cross out EFIS, which looks nothing like brick. And that leaves us with two options to say thin brick exterior or thin brick on thin set mortar. Okay, we've got two options left. That's the understand and apply, right? That's, I understand that I need to maintain this key criteria that the client has given me, and that helps me filter my options. After that, it's just math, and you can do the math any number of ways. You can say that, you can say basically we need $420,000 of savings and we need it over 30,000 square feet of area, which, you know, gives us a savings of $14 per square foot. And there's only one option here that is $14 cheaper per square foot than the first system, and that's this one down here. So by process of elimination, precast concrete with thin brick exterior. You can also do it a little bit longer way and say, okay, cost savings here is $11 a square foot times 30,000 square feet gives us $330,000. That's not enough to meet our 420,000 requirement. So again, process of elimination, the bottom one. That's an understand and apply question. What's the important information in this scenario? How do I apply that to this criteria to find an answer? The other type of question that we run into is a analyze and evaluate question. In this case, they're asking you to analyze these various system situations over here and say, okay, if I had this in a set of construction documents, how would I ask the contractor to price this? Would I ask them for an allowance, which is a lump sum of money to cover an undefined system? For an alternate, which is, hey, if I do this, it's X, but if I do that, it's Y, how much for each scenario? Do I ask for a unit price, which is, hey, I have, I need to put in a sidewalk, but I don't know how much yet. Tell me how much per square foot, and that way I can design as much as I can afford. And so basically, this is one of those drag and drops where you're going to take, okay, well, an alternate makes the most sense for these occupancy sensors. Sorry, these occupancy sensors in lieu of key phrase, standard wall switches. Well, that sounds like price this or that, alternate. An automated irrigation system at a roof area. Well, we've got an established area, roof area. We just don't have, you know, a totally designed system yet. So give me an allowance to cover that scope, and then we'll move along once we get more detail in the design of that system. So, by the way, earthwork materials would probably be a unit price. So that's an example of all three for you. But that's, you know, analyze, you know, what's the best fit for each of these scenarios and evaluate them based on what you already understand of how these contract documents work and what these terms mean here on the left. So slightly more complex than an understand apply, but it's still not rote memorization. If you don't know what an allowance is, you're screwed. Because theoretically, if you know what an alternate is and a unit price are, you can look at these situations and say, well, that one's not really a good fit for either of those, so it must be an allowance, right? So there's some leeway for understanding the terms that may be foreign as you go. What the exams cover. I can't tell you that because there's a lot. My recommendation is you check past the ARE section. They've got it broken out. They've got basically a guide. It's not going to tell you what material to study, but it will tell you what concepts you need to cover by the time you're done studying. So that'll tell you whether your study material is perhaps deficient in an area or two, so that you can go look for a fully rounded understanding. Moving back into the opinion territory, what order of exam should I take the exams in? Okay, we're doing decent on time. My opinion is that starting with practice management is difficult for most people. Like, it's the one we tend to default to because it's the first one that's listed, but it's kind of like speaking Greek for most of us because we don't do practice management in our day-to-day jobs. We don't know anything about how firms are structured or what staffing considerations look like. We don't know what certain contract terminology is. It's very foreign to the day-to-day experience, particularly of emerging professionals. And so I think a lot of people run into that one full of enthusiasm and get blown back by the sheer weight of foreign content. And they get burned because they thought it was going to be a lot easier than it turned out to be. And I think you see that reflected in some of the passing statistics. So I encourage people to start with something they're more familiar with. If you do schematic design all day, every day, maybe that's programming and analysis. But for most of us, we're in construction documents. And so I suggest construction and evaluation. I think there's the most concreteness in that material, like the most, this black and whiteness, right and wrong. There's a lot less subjectivity, in my opinion. And if you do a lot of construction documents, really the only thing you might need to learn for CE is maybe some soils and definitely contracts. Just understanding the relationships between all parties and sort of the legal obligations of each one in X or Y situation. Construction evaluation has historically had the highest pass rate. It's actually tied with project management recently. So I think CE is probably the most approachable of exams. And so I recommend start with that one. It also serves as a decent lead-in to project management because they overlap in content. You can learn contracts really well for CE, and then that information folds over into project management well, which then folds over into practice management well. It's kind of three rings on a Venn diagram. And there's a little bit of overlap between CE and practice management, but there's a lot of overlap between project management and the 2 exams on either side of it. So that's how I recommend, kind of passing through that series. And I actually recommend studying for project management and practice management together because there's so much overlap in their content. The study materials have a hard time splitting it up. And so some information that you need for one exam is in the study guides for the other. And most people I see who have success have studied for both. And a lot of people that I see struggle have only studied for one. And so it's anecdotal, but I recommend testing in this kind of sequence and lumping them together like that. And then basically repeating that pattern with the next series. Programming and analysis is a fairly standalone exam. It doesn't depend on any information from the 3 you just finished. But its content really kind of leads into PPD well, which itself has a lot of overlap with PDD. If you think about the difference between these 3 exams, you can kind of say that PA is schematic design, where PPD is like design development and early CDs, and PDD is solidly in the CDs, construction documents. That's roughly analogous. It's not exclusive. But you can see how that kind of flow of information would make sense, moving from the most abstract and kind of broad down to the most specific. But even still, there's a lot of overlap between DDs and early CDs and vice versa. So I think you benefit a lot from studying PPD and PDD together. The other benefit to that is if you take those 2 together, well, actually, even if you just take one, there's a lot of mental fatigue after finishing that. These are big exams. And so if you take one and you don't pass, that's just only frustration, right? All you know is frustration and, you want to give up. But if you take 2, well, there's a chance you pass one. And so you have that benefit of success kind of belaying the frustration. And so you still get that sort of encouragement to, dive back in and finish up with the one that you still need to work on. So there's a strategy there in like motivating yourself with an extra chance at success, if that makes sense. But I've also just seen it to be very successful in its own right. So again, all opinion here, but opinion born from experience. Now we're diving into study materials. We have 20 minutes to do it. I think we can cover this and give it all the attention it deserves. Before we do, does anybody have questions about strategy, exam experience, that kind of stuff before we move on? All right. Well, if I see something pop up, I will answer it at any time. Feel free to interrupt me. I want to make sure we don't leave anybody confused. Christopher, I'm not sure I'm familiar with what you're referring
to. This is Chris. So for those that might have a disability, you can apply for disability services, and depending on those disabilities, they'll either extend time or extended breaks or testing in a center without the earmuffs on.
Yeah. Thank you. That's not something I have had the chance to talk about or actually look into much, and I really should. But that's absolutely, if there is a need for accommodation, and CARB has, at least the reputation I hear is that they're very intentional about accommodating every exam candidate's needs. And so don't feel like they're trying to shove you in a box. They generally will work with you. Thanks for bringing that up, Chris. So diving into study materials. There's a lot of it. It's only gotten more and more these past couple of years since I tested. I'll tell you which ones I have personal experience with and which ones are just reputation. But just remember, everything's continuously evolving these days, it seems like. And so I recommend that when your exams come up and you're looking for material, this is a good place to start, but it's not exclusive. Ask around. Facebook groups, I'm told, have a lot of active communities of people talking about material. Remember, everybody's opinion is a grain of salt, because if they're in the process of testing, they probably don't know much more than you. Simply because they locked in on whatever they have or whatever they're using, and unless they're seeing wild success with it, it might just be what works for them. It might not necessarily be what works for you, but it's certainly worth looking into. And the first place I would look is NCARB, because they're going to put out the most relevant content, because they're the ones who write the exams. And they're not going to go, give you a 12-hour lecture series on exactly what to expect for each exam, but they will give you the highlights of what to look for and what your study material should cover. And so definitely start with their YouTube channel and their handbook for each exam. NCARB has also started doing something really cool. They're basically partnering with test prep providers and saying, okay, we're not going to say that this is like all sufficient for preparing for exams. They're not calling these things one-stop shops, but they are saying these providers are covering enough of the right content with enough thoroughness that we are comfortable putting our stamp of approval on them as a provider. They call that approved test prep providers. The only one that was part of that program when I was testing was Black Spectacles. So I can speak to them specifically. These other two are newer additions to the list. Black Spectacles, my thoughts. They came onto the scene kind of as the big brand in study materials pretty early on. And their big selling point was they were the videos. Everybody knew that Black Spectacle study videos were, a unique and hot product. And then you actually signed up for the service, and it turns out the videos are not good, just not good. They're long, they're not especially relevant, they're hard to sort through, they're hard to focus on, they're slow, they're just, they would have been great when they were the only thing on the market, but now I didn't bother with them. I had access to them for free through my firm, and I just ignored them because they were unhelpful. The practice exams, though, bar none, are fantastic. I think the practice exams were why NCARB gave them the stamp of approval first, because they perfectly emulate the experience of sitting down and taking the exam, interface and all. So yeah, practice exams are fantastic. Flashcards are fine. They're kind of expensive, but a lot of firms, your big firms in particular, are starting to do firm-wide licenses. So advocate for that. They have other options in their higher tiers for like study guides and workshops, but nobody I know has ever had access to that high of a tier, so can't really speak to those. So long story short, I give them a solid where if you've got a firm license, take advantage of it. And if you're looking for practice exams, theirs is the best. But I wouldn't bother with much else that they have. Architect exam prep. This one I haven't used. these guys are pretty new. I like that they put out a free podcast. I like one-time purchase model options. I don't tend to like subscriptions. I think subscriptions have a weird incentive to them where it's like they make money the longer you're a member, but theoretically, if they were doing their job well, you'd stop being a member quickly because you'd be passing them. So, you know, it seems like kind of a weird conflict of interest, but I get that it's a, you know, a business model that is helpful for them to maintain consistent revenue. So just, I wish that we could move away from the subscription models personally. So that's why I like these guys. They're one-time purchases for individual exams or bundle all 6. Expensive up front, but if you can pull the cash together, I think it's generally more effective or more efficient than paying for a subscription that, oops, the month's gone and I never used it. But I like kind of how complete their offerings are. The study guide, the flashcards, the audio companion, which is great theoretically for when you can't sit there staring at a screen, you know, listen to something while you're at making dinner or doing a workout, that kind of thing. Generally good option that I don't see a lot of people have. And then of course, they've got that 30-day access to an exam simulator, which doesn't start when you sign up or when you make your purchase. It starts whenever you tell them you want to start it. So you can study for several months and then activate your exam simulator and just use it when you need it. So that's cool. They have coaching, which only a few different services offer, but it's expensive, of course, as it always is. Long story short, I like a lot of what they're selling in theory. I just don't know anybody who's used it. So if you do, let me know, because I'm very curious about their offerings. They are very proud of their material. They make some pretty big claims about the benefits, and they have like these guarantees on their website where if you jump through a certain number of hoops and use their material, they guarantee either success or, you know, your money back. Read the fine print on those, but if you're willing to, you know, play that game, could be a solid option. But even if you're not gonna, you know, go for the guarantees, still not a bad, you know, one-time purchase, and seems like a really solid offering package. PPI to pass. Last one on the list for these guys, for the approved providers. This is also a subscription model. It's per exam. It seems to function kind of like a college course where they've got their like textbook, and then kind of they work you through series of study plan and diagnostic quizzes, exams, that kind of stuff. I will say I have some experience with their content because this company is the group that bought up Brightwood and Ballast. If you hear old farts like me talking about, oh, back in my day, we only had these Brightwood books and they were like 3 inches thick. We're not exaggerating that much. They really were monsters. They were just hard copy books that you could buy and study, and they were mostly for 4.0, but they made a quick adjustment and repackaged them for 5.0. Looks like this is the next step of that. They've taken that content and evolved it to the 21st century, if it were. So I like the sort of proven quality of the material that's been used to study for these exams for a long time. I just don't know how they've adapted it. Theoretically, they've kind of fleshed out the ecosystem of material around it and made it more sort of approachable and more robust, which is good, very good. So I have, you know, if I were studying, this is probably something I would look into pretty hard. The worst thing that could happen here is that they took those big, thick guidebooks and the rest of it's like half-baked. And so you're just stuck there with a thick guidebook and you just end up having to read the thing, or maybe you just cancel the subscription and you move on. And worst you burn is a month. So I do think they're not the most unaffordable of systems like this. So if you're worried about the budget, this also might be a reasonable start. Other providers that are not generally listed by NCARB, but people I know, including myself, found them helpful. This is a long list, and these offerings tend to be less robust, but they all have their strengths and weaknesses. So Hyperfine, these are one-time purchase, good value. $30 to $60 per exam is what you'd pay for a month of subscription anywhere else, and you get to keep it for however long you're studying. So I like that. Okay, I see Tanya's adding some resources in here. Yep, I see Young Architect. I don't know Elif Bayram. I don't know We Are. So check the chat if you guys are looking for other resources, because obviously I'm not the definitive source on everything, but we will go through some of those. So thank you, Tanya. Hyperfine. If you're looking for structure, this seems like a good way to go. They basically give you a course with things to study broken out for a very reasonable price. And it tends to focus on, okay, go study this from here and that from there and that from there. And so they're kind of an aggregator. They've got practice exams that are bundled. I really like their free resources page. Definitely take advantage of that, because it's the only place you can find the Schiff Hardin lectures these days, which are an absolute must, in my opinion, for studying contracts. So definitely take advantage of their free page. And if you want to see what their structure is all about, it's worth considering. Try it out for an exam, one of the $30 exams, and just see what their coursework kind of looks like. Okay, so there's a service called ArchiPrep. Chris, thanks for adding that in the chat. If you're an associate AIA, ArchiPrep is available to you. Interesting, I did a study group through the AIA. This is how I tackled my first 4 exams, and they didn't actually use ArchiPrep. So I'm curious if that was just something that wasn't on their radar at the time. Yeah, looks like another monthly subscription service. So those are very prevalent these days, and it's hard to tell which ones are great and which ones are okay. Generally speaking, I don't think any of them are bad, but like I said, with Black Spectacles, some resources are better than others. And speaking of some that are better than others, I hear good things about AmberBook. They are somewhat of an expensive subscription model. They've gotten more affordable lately. And if you get a group together with 6 people who all buy in at the same time, you get a pretty significant group discount. There are apparently like Facebook groups and resources that will pair you with other people looking to purchase AmberBook subscriptions, so that you don't have to actually know the 6 people that you sign in with or that you sign up with. So that's actually a pretty clever loophole and incentive structure. So I would definitely take advantage of that if you're looking for it. AmberBook used to be, in my opinion, the throw money at it solution, where it's like nothing else is working for you. It's time to open up the checkbook and just buy your way to success, because they were, expensive, but very proud of their resources for a reason. And that reason was their resources were intensive to take and generally successful for the people who used them. Problem is, not a lot of people used them because one, they were expensive, and two, they advocate for a study all the exams together model. And as you can imagine, studying for any of these exams is a bear. But studying for all of them together just seems overwhelming to me personally. Now I see the appeal of these materials because they're very well put together and very reputable. But if you're going to do that, I would say clear out the next 6 months of your schedule and devote your life to getting your money out of this subscription. Because if you're going to get all these exams knocked out, you're going to need to condense your study schedule so that you're not forgetting things over the course of months and months. And so that you're not buying an idle subscription. DesignerHacks. These guys are pretty straightforward. It's a one-time purchase with a big bank of practice questions. This is a good time for me to rant about practice exams. I love practice exams. I think you should use plenty of practice exams and practice questions. But my rule was you don't use them more than 2 weeks before your practice test. I think a lot of people get caught in the trap of taking a practice exam just to see what the content's like and what the questions are. And they only have like 4 practice exams. So they'll take one a week and they think they're learning the content because as they take their, they study and they take these exams and they make flashcards based on the questions they missed. They come back, a couple weeks later and they take the exams again and they're getting a much better score. They're doing so much better than they did the first time. Well, yeah, it's because you've seen these questions before. But it feels like it's because you know the content better. Well, you only really know the content that's in those specific questions, and you only really know it in the way that those questions have asked it of you. You don't know how to juggle that information and apply it in various situations because you don't really know the concepts. And so I've seen people struggle with the actual ARE exams, thinking that they're getting really frustrated because they're doing so well on their practice exams. Why are these so much harder? And it's because you've kind of put yourself in a loop of studying only the same content over and over again, and in a very inflexible way. So in my opinion, resources like this are great. Use practice exams and practice questions, but don't depend on them. Use them like they're intended to be, purely for kind of checking what you know, and then don't use any question more than twice, because after that, you really need to just go back and study the content. Pluralsight. Not an ARE specific website. This is one of those general, like, sign up for the service and you can browse our library of courses, all, at your fingertips. And so you can learn to code, or you can learn to paint, or you can learn to do Photoshop, all that stuff. But they do have a good series called Prepare for the ARE by Kevin Greenling that I recommend. These videos are what I wish the Black Spectacles videos are, or were. I really like Kevin's series. He only had 4 exams up and available when I was testing, and I only found him after I took my first 2 exams. So I only really used them for 2 of them, but they are very discreet in the sense that you can find exactly the video on the content you want. They're nice and concise, but they're very approachable and understandable, and the content is presented in a broad enough way that you can get a feel for how it would be applied in various different questions. I think they're very composed videos and a solid option. Look into the free trial if you want to just like go look at specific content, or if you want to just see what the videos are like without committing to the subscription. I think you'll find that it's very helpful and probably what you're hoping a video series would be. Probably not your primary study content because it's hard for any video series to be that robust, but a very good resource for when you don't want to be sitting down reading your content. Young architect. Didn't know about these guys until after I passed, except by reputation, because they their big push was their boot camps. Used to be that they were basically just he was basically just the boot camp guy, where, you know, a group of people would sign up at once and he'd personally mentor them and coach them up every week, hold them accountable to their study schedule, that kind of stuff. He still does that. It's expensive, but very helpful for people who need that kind of accountability system, which I highly suggest everybody have. I just don't normally recommend people go online to pay for it. I would say he started making his courses available just as, you know, individual purchases. So if you know anybody who's taken his boot camp, or if you have a group of people who want to split the cost and see what one of his courses is like, probably worth it. Just because, again, it's a one-time purchase, and he's got a lot of experience coaching people in exams, which means that he's in the material day in, day out. So probably a good resource there. But again, I don't think I know anybody who's actually used them personally. So if you do, let me know your experience. Quizlet is not really a study guide or ARE resource, but it's a good app for flashcards. And people have made banks of flashcards on ARE content. So, and you can just like use those. So use it for making flashcards, use it for studying other people's flashcards when you're on the train or something. Handy little resource just to literally have in your pocket. Bonus, the Schiff Hardin lectures. Pulled this link off of the Hyperfine page. This guy is a really cool college professor. And I say he's a cool college professor because he's not just a professor, he's actually a lawyer who works in construction law in Chicago and lectures at the architecture university nearby. And he just does a great job making contracts feel personable and accessible and relevant, because it's his day-to-day. Like he sees, well, we had a contractor who had this question, and we had an architect with this question, and contract law says this, and generally we interpret it this way, and like just made it so much easier than trying to study the contracts themselves, because who wants to study AIA contracts? Like that'd be a nightmare. Finding the relevant information would be a pain. He brings all of the relevant information front and center, and as a bonus, they're real easy to listen to while you're doing something else. So highly recommend the Schiff Hardin lectures. He used to host them on the website for his legal firm, but I think either he left or he retired or something, so they're no longer hosted there. And this is the only place I've been able to find them. Definitely use it for his CE and PJM. Okay, that's all the resources that I have, you know, personal or reputational familiarity with. As you see, we've got a bunch of really cool resources I didn't even know existed being mentioned in the chat here. Thanks to everybody who's recommended a few. Obviously, the options can be overwhelming. There is a very real risk of decision paralysis with all of these study materials available. What's the best one? What's the, you know, what's the thing that's going to get me over this hump that I'm stuck on, that I can't seem to work through? I can't tell you that because it's unique to each person. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is your personal exam experience. And so I recommend if something's not working, you can try something else. But my personal opinion is that nothing helps you push through like having a study group, like having people there to hold you accountable to what you said you were going to study, The way I passed my first 4 exams, I met with a group of 3 other people every week, and we just brought flashcards that we made over the course of the week, and we quizzed each other on concepts because we all theoretically went over the same stuff. And it was a really great way to sort of refresh our memory on the experience and make the most of our time together, but also hold ourselves accountable to having actually covered the content in a meaningful way. For reference, this is my bank of flashcards. It's a little washed out, but which exam is this? This is programming and analysis, and it's, you know, a solid handful of index cards with very vague terms or concepts on the front, and just all the information I could think could be relevant on the back. And my whole process was give myself a vague prompt and regurgitate as much information as I could possibly apply all at once. And that worked out pretty well for me. Just the process of making these cards makes it real easy to go back and reference information that you need and filter by whether you're getting it right or getting it wrong. I think that's a really solid way to approach studying for exams personally. The other thing it does is it lets you get offline. And these days we're also distracted by devices. The way I studied was I took a big thick book of study material and I went into a buffet, generally a CC's Pizza, not proud to admit it. And I made flashcards and snacked and worked my way through the study book. I gained weight, but I also finished all of my exams in about a year. You know, your results may vary. Everyone studies differently, but there's a value in leaving your phone in the car and just getting rid of all the distractions and buckling down. Not everybody has that ability or opportunity, but if I can get offline and study offline, I suggest it. Okay, I think, whoops, yep, that's the last slide I've got. You're welcome to hit me up with questions after this. My email, ntx.axp, that stands for North Texas Architectural Experience Professional, ntx.axp@gmail.com. I am happy to talk about this ad nauseum. I will talk your ear off. And if you've got input and experience in any other materials and you'd like me to know that too, so that I can take your experience and, you know, include it with this kind of conversation for everyone else, please reach out and we will schedule a call. And I would love to just download what you know and what your experiences are. Because the more I know, the better I can help other candidates like y'all, because this is not something that we need to be tackling by ourselves. Architecture is not a profession of individuals. We draw on the strengths and talents of each other. And I think with that, going through these exams should reflect that as well.
Josh?
Yes, sir.
This is Jim White. I'm a professor emeritus at Texas Tech University College of Architecture. I was one of the members of the task force that developed this ARE 5.0. I want to congratulate you and tell you what a wonderful and most comprehensive presentation you made today to these interns on how to study for the exam and the drawbacks and the things that they have to concentrate on to pass all 6 sections.
Well, thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from someone like you, and I appreciate your presence here today.
I understand you work for Huckabee?
Yes, sir.
Well, they're one of my pride and joy firms.
I'm pretty happy to be here too. And thank you for being here.
Well, I just was notified this was coming on. And of course, I knew I'd already passed the exam years and years ago, but I was involved in developing this ARE 5. And so I think it was a wonderful presentation that you did. You really went thoroughly in everything you did.
I appreciate that. It's a labor of love.
If you see Mr. Chris Huckabee, tell him I said hello.
Will do. I'll make note of that. Are there any questions before we dismiss everyone? Anything, if you haven't gotten the chance, scroll quick through the chat, make note of any resources that I haven't had time to talk on today. But that's all the content I had today. If you need to log off, be my guest. I'll hang on for a little. And yes, you should get an email when we post this online. We're going to make sure that everybody has access to this conversation.